Chapter 4, 21st December 1908. Sandy came around slowly and, without opening her eyes, her fingers searched the contours of her forehead, wincing when she found a tender lump where something had quite definitely hit her. Her fingers travelled to her right cheek, which felt bruised. What had just happened? 1 minute she had been in an old music hall, and the next minute she had been falling as if the floor had quite literally disappeared from underneath, and she had landed in... Well, that was the thing. Where had she landed? All she could remember was a blinding light, cacophony of terrible smells, thick, eye-watering smoke, and a roaring sound like hundreds of people yelling, cheering, and stamping their feet. She must have dreamt it, though her bruised face and bump on her forehead told her different. Had she actually fallen through a hole in the floor and bumped it? Tentatively, she opened her eyes. She was in a gloomy office lit by small flickering lights, with an old-fashioned leather-topped wooden desk and an old-fashioned wooden chair. The desk was neatly laid out with a wire tray full of letters, a bottle of ink, a fountain pen lying in a black oblong tray, an antique candlestick telephone, and a wooden box with numbers on it, which on closer inspection Sandy realised was a calendar displaying the date 21st December 1908. She could hear the sound of horses' hooves as a constant clip-clop from outside, the occasional parp of a vintage car horn, and the sound of voices shouting and cheering. The latter seemed to be coming from somewhere on the other side of the office door. What she didn't hear was buses, cars and sirens, which you always heard in the city centre. She got shakily to her feet, walked the couple of steps to the window and gazed out onto an unbelievable scene below. The street was without a doubt the Trongate, but there was no sign of the minibus that she had travelled therein, or the modern street lamps which had washed the pavements with their bluish-white glow. Instead, pools of pale amber light flickered here and there, cast by the sort of lamps which lit the way in The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. Wires stretched across the street from building to building in zigzagging lines, and old-fashioned trams trundled along beneath them. A constant stream of horse-drawn carts and carriages, and the occasional vintage car, their small headlamps like pale yellow smudges in the thick fog-filled night, replaced the usual flow of motorised traffic. It had been cold and clear when they had arrived earlier that night. Earlier tonight? She thought to herself. I only got here tonight? How can the whole street have changed so much in just a few hours? Was she still dreaming? She pinched herself to make sure, the sharp pain confirming that she wasn't. The street below was fascinating. It was like the scene in a film. That must be it, she thought. They're making a film. Last year Sandy had seen a film being made in George Square. They had blocked off a whole area to modern traffic and made it look like it had done in the Victorian days, with horse-drawn carriages and people in fancy dress costumes. That must be what she saw now. The Trongate of the 21st century, made up to look like it would have done hundreds of years ago. It was the only logical reason for the radical change outside, but it looked so real, right down to the thick fog. The door to the small old-fashioned office opened, and in walked a red-faced little man with a moustache twisted into neat points that turned up at the ends. He wore round glasses, a bowler hat, and a tweed three-piece suit. Albert? She tentatively asked. He looked like a much younger version of the man who had told them all about the music hall. In fact, apart from the lack of grey hair and wrinkles, they were identical. The man flashed her an angry look. "That's Mr. Pickard to you, boy," he barked as he stood with his arms folded and glared at her. "Who in blazes do you think you are?" Sandy was stunned. Boy? He'd called her a boy? So she had short hair, but so did a lot of girls. She had never been called a boy before. She was obviously a girl. "Well, boy?" Sandy felt a little prickle of annoyance and was going to correct him for his mistake, but her mouth didn't follow her brain. Instead, she found herself apologising. Sorry, sir, I just woke up here a moment ago and I think I must have fainted or something, she answered honestly, rubbing the lump on her forehead. I think I hit my head. How could she have thought that this man was old Albert? Albert had seemed nice and gentle. Maybe he was Albert's son or something. The man looked her up and down with a puzzled, slightly repulsed expression on his face, as if he had never seen anything quite like her before. Sandy felt uncomfortable under his scrutiny and squirmed. Judging by the strange costume and the way you arrived on stage, I take it you're a young magician that decided he was going to make his debut tonight unannounced and disrupt my show. Now, young man, that isn't the way you go about things, though I hear from my staff that it was quite a spectacular entrance and scared off the useless act that was on before you. Costume? Stage debut? Sandy thought. What's he on about? I'm not a magician, sir. I'm with the school party doing the ghost hunt, she said a little uncertainly. What are you talking about, lad? School party? Ghost hunt? Is this some new thing? Some new act? Do you perform some kind of ghost show? If you want me to book you, lad, then you can go through the usual procedures and audition like everyone else, he growled, still eyeing Sandy sceptically. Come back tomorrow morning at 11 and don't be late. I want to see your ghost show. You impress my stage manager, and that's no easy task. The man stepped over to the door and held it open. What's your name, boy? He asked. Sandy, she muttered as she approached the door. She was going to say, and I'm a girl, but once again her mouth did not agree with her brain, and she ran through the open door instead, desperate to get away from this weird, rude man and find her classmates. Outside the small office was a short corridor which led back to the music hall. However, as she entered the music hall, nothing was quite how she remembered it. The old crumbling auditorium, which had been empty except for sleeping classmates, teachers and parents, was now completely crammed with costumed people who sat or stood intently watching a black and white silent film. The decor was renewed, not a peeling layer or hole in the plaster to be seen, and the dirty yellow and brown ceiling was now a midnight blue sky, scattered with hundreds of gold stars lit by circular lights that hung from the centre of the high ceiling. Sandy wove her way through the dense crowd, sure that her friends would be somewhere in the middle. Mr. Oakley must have organised for her class to be extras in the film as a surprise. They'd only just finished studying the Victorians and Edwardians, and he had constantly gone on about the smell and how people today wouldn't be able to stand the pong. Well, whoever the film's director was, they were certainly going for realism. The smell was rotten, really stinking and full of tobacco smoke that stung her eyes. It was too realistic. It was making Sandy feel sick. All thoughts of her classmates were instantly forgotten and replaced with a sudden, desperate need to find a way out into the fresh air before she threw up everywhere. She turned around and pushed her way back through the noisy, packed, stinking music hall with both hands firmly clasped over her mouth. Finally, with some relief, she found her way to a staircase and made her way down to a small foyer and ticket office. She dashed across to a set of large wooden doors, which she pushed open and stepped onto the street outside. She took her hands away from her mouth and, with a prospect of fresh air, took a deep breath in and instantly regretted it. Outside smelled almost as bad as inside. Horse manure and something pungent like rotten eggs mixed with rotting fish was so strong on the air that she could taste it, and the fog was so thick she could feel it on her skin. The street was bustling with people dressed in old-fashioned clothes. Some of them looked ragged and half-starved, and all of them cast Sandy a look of utter surprise, staring at her puffer coat, her jeans, and most of all her furry snow boots. This was all wrong. This couldn't be a film set. It was too real. Her stomach clenched and fear crept up her spine as she finally realised the impossible truth. If it wasn't a movie set and it wasn't a dream, she was not capable of dreaming this. Somehow, as unbelievable and impossible as it seemed, she had travelled back in time. Giving in to the stench-fuelled nausea, she threw up on the pavement. A woman who was passing at the time cursed at her as some of the vomit spattered the ragged hem of her long skirt. As Sandy straightened back up and tried her best not to cry, a grubby-faced boy appeared at her side. "Looks like you had a good-sized dinner. Shame it's on the pavement now, though," he said with a wide, friendly smile. Well, that is the end of Chapter 4. Please join us again on the first Thursday of March, which will be the 7th of March, for Chapter 5. Thank you for joining us.